So for you guys who have ever grown to the countryside, for me, I've always liked the countryside, like Maryland, Masailand, Narok, Kajiado, Nyeri, Muranga. I mean, if you look at the old homesteads, compounds, they used to have real distance between the houses, right? I mean, your uncle's place, your grandmother's place, your father's place. Sometimes it was a genuine walk apart from each other, right? And somehow, I mean, everybody knew everything. Who was struggling, you know, who needed help with school fees, whose child hadn't eaten properly that week. That was distance and total awareness of each other at the same time. But now look at a Nairobi flat block. The walls are thin enough that you can hear your neighbor's phone buzzing through the plaster at midnight. You know, close enough to hear him cough, close to hear even the alarm, or even close enough to hear them coming in their houses after they come from you know the modern day 9 to 5. And most people couldn't tell you his name, or her name. That's not just a Kenyan observation, though it shows up here in a specific way. And in 2023, the United States Surgeon General issued a formal advisory declaring loneliness. They declared loneliness and isolation a public health epidemic. You know, the kind of language usually reserved for a disease outbreak, not a feeling. The numbers behind it were stark enough to justify that language. And roughly half of American adults reported experiencing loneliness in recent years. You know, insufficient social connection was linked to a rise of premature death, comparable to smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. And since 2003, the average American had gained roughly 24 hours a month spent alone, and lost about 20 hours a month spent face to face with friends. And that shift had already happened before anyone had had a global pandemic. You know, I mean, the advisory also found something specific about the tool everyone has assumed was solving this. People who spend more than 2 hours a day on social media were roughly twice as likely to report feeling socially isolated as people who spend under 30 minutes, you know, not connected by the extra hours, more isolated because of them. And here's the part that's distinctly which is distinctly locally though, and it's not just about phones. It's not about phones. Kenyan family structure has been changing underneath the loneliness data in a way that compounds it. I mean, traditionally, raising a child here was never just a parent job. You know, aunts, uncles, grandparents, the whole compound. They shared that responsibility, and adults leaned on that same web when things got hard. They relied to everybody around them. I mean, research research tackling urban Kenyan household has documented a clear shift over the few decades. Smaller household size in cities, a steady move from extended family living arrangements towards nuclear, economically self-contained units, with rural to urban migration doing a lot of that work. You know, family ties don't disappear entirely. Remittance keeps flowing back to shags. You know, phone calls keep happening, but the physical everyday presence of that wider support web thins out faster once someone moves to the city chasing work. you know so you end up with two different erosions stacking on top of each other. The global one, which is technology quietly replacing real contact with something that looks like contact but doesn't function like it, and the local one, which is an entire support structure that used to absorb loneliness by default, simply by proximity, getting steadily replaced by a flat with with thin walls and strangers on the other side of them. I mean, I go back and forth on how much to romanticize the old structure, if I'm honest, because I don't think it's fair to pretend the homestead model had no real cost of its own. There was less privacy, there was less room to to be a person outside of your own role in the family. You know, plenty of people who grew up inside that structure left it on purpose, for good reason, chasing exactly the kind of independence a nuclear household in the city actually offers. And that trade wasn't irrational. Some of it was a real upgrade. But I don't think you can look at the loneliness data honestly and pretend nothing was lost in that trade either. The old structure was inefficient, noisy, occasionally suffocating, and also almost by accident extremely good at making sure nobody quietly disappeared into isolation without somebody noticing. You know, and the new structure is more private, more efficient, more suited to a single person building an independent life. But it's also much better at letting someone go weeks without a real conversation, surrounded the entire time by more contacts, more followers, more notifications than any homestead ever had names for, you know. And this is like the backward law by Alan Watts, that chasing an positive experience is itself a negative experience, and chasing a negative experience is it's accepting a negative experience itself is a positive it is a positive experience. But let me come back to what I was trying to talk about. I mean, I don't think the answer is moving back to the compound. Even that were possible for the most people at this point. I think the answer is noticing what the old structure got right by accident, and trying to rebuild some versions of it on purpose, because it clearly isn't going to happen automatically anymore. That's from living closer to people. But anyway, I'd say this: the walls in that flat block are still thin enough. The walls inside my flat block are still thin enough to hear a phone buzzing through them at midnight, to hear somebody coming to their apartments, to hear someone opening the balcony door, to even hear people walking outside, or even hearing cars, you know, on the road because I live near the highway. But it's worth it sometime finding out at some point whose phone that actually buzzing sometimes. I usually ask myself that question. Alright guys, thanks for watching.